try to make this a lively session and as interactive as possible. Now, there's a problem with that, because up here we only have one microphone. So my threat, we've got two, or at least got two. So, but do feel free to interrupt members of the panel. Otherwise, I will have to identify people who I think should be saying something. And what we're going to try to do, actually, is we're going to try and showcase the IoTSF. So far this morning, we've heard, I think, two very good keynotes. I'm always a bit worried about those keynotes where the speaker says, I don't want to scare you, but. And I think that was a kind of tone of both of them a bit. And they were actually a little bit scary. So I want to talk, I hope we will talk, a little bit about how the IoTSF is organised, has been organised, and will be organised in order to address some of these concerns. And there are basically three messages, you know, the old thing, you know, tell people what you're going to say it, and then tell them you've said it. So the three messages I hope we will leave with all of you is something about the IoTSF's achievements, something about the IoTSF's sources of expertise, and something about the IoTSF's future ambitions, because that's what this is all about, past, present, and future. And that's what we on the steering board spend quite a lot of time discussing, and I hope we can distill some of our expertise for you today. Do I have to repeat all of that? Okay, that's a relief. Otherwise, it would have been 10 past 2. Anyway, I'm determined to make this run on as long as possible, as you can see. Right, I'm not going to introduce people. You've got the brief bios of who they are in the programme notes. And that will cut back a little bit on time. What I'm going to do is feed each of them a question first. But I very much hope, as I say, that other members of the panel, and indeed people in the audience, I mean, don't worry about this microphone business. Just kind of put your hand up and ask a question or make a point, because it's important that we make this lively and interactive. But Richard, if I may, to kick us off. John earlier this morning mentioned the IoTSF assurance framework, the crown jewel, he said, that was. And it is indeed. It's the foundation stone of the whole organisation and the whole approach, the IoTSF assurance framework. Can you tell us, you've been involved, I think, since the beginning, can you tell us a bit about how it evolved and how it can help companies meet their security goals? And that phrase is a bit deliberately vague, but both technical and wider than technical, if you like. And a bit about how that security framework assurance framework is still relevant in a world where we've got a lot of regulation coming at us, we've got a lot of other sort of voluntary efforts of various kinds to try and tell us what to do when it comes to security. You know, is the IoTSF assurance framework still relevant? So where did it come from, and why does it still matter? Richard.
Good morning. Thank you, Stephen. A bit of a case of where to start. Probably one of the first observations is, I don't know about anybody else, but I'm at the moment having a bit of a deja vu moment in that nearly 10 years ago now, we were talking about standardisation and all saying it's coming, it's coming, it's coming. And here we are, and it's only really in the last 18 months that standards and regulation have been coming through. And as you were saying, Stephen, that prompts the inevitable question, which is, well, so was the IoTSF too early? Was standardisation too late? I'm not going to answer that question because it's probably slightly contentious. But the thing about it being that it was obvious to a lot of people that cybersecurity was obviously going to become, as products became more connected, that cybersecurity was going to become a larger issue. But if I can just set a little bit of context, the foundations for a lot of this are not that new. So there are industries out there that have been dealing with not necessarily cybersecurity in the kind of way that's been outlined already, which might be nation state, criminal, etc. But if you look back to two obvious markets, telephony and particularly media, both of those markets, for example, have not been dealing with cybersecurity in the sense that perhaps we know it today of hacks taking place, and we suddenly see a whole load of Windows computers, blue screen of death. But certainly for the telco industry, I mean, they go back to the period, particularly in the US, for example, for those people who can remember back to MCI, who were doing long-distance telephone calls at obviously preferential rates against things like the incumbent, AT&T. There were hacks back then that involved, technology to do with tones on telephony. And coming a little bit further forward, you get into, obviously, the likes of the satellite companies, the Canal Plus, the Sky Plus, Sky. They've all got revenue protection to do because they are distributing their suppliers, the film industry, for example, with media, and they need to be able to protect their own revenue, but also they've got to do all of the things around digital rights management. And if you look at a lot of the things that they were dealing with then, and we're talking 25, 30 years ago, an awful lot of that all hinges around revenue protection. The types of hacks were probably slightly different to the ones that we're starting to see to emerge today, but still all of those underlying principles of how do you manage particularly widely distributed high volumes of devices that are connected in some way is actually not that new. So for a lot of people, one might say, well, but my set-top box wasn't connected to the internet until relatively recently. But set-top boxes were getting over-air updates 20, 30 years ago. It happened to come over the satellite, or it came over the aerial feed overnight.
So Richard, let me interrupt. So you're saying that the assurance framework we've got at IoTSF, it's got these long roots in a kind of pre-internet, pre-IoT world, and that's great. So we didn't just create it on the back of an envelope. We drew on that experience. But surely you're not telling me that there isn't something new about the brave new IoT world? Absolutely,
which is that suddenly you are now applying the sorts of principles that those industries were already familiar with, but it's now applying. If we take, for example, the EU's CRA scope, it's now being applied to any product that's got a digital element in it, to use the CRA term, and is connected. So suddenly we have a much wider scope, and one of the other challenges you tend to see is a change in the way operations proceed. And in fact, has been alluded already, the car industry is a good example. Whereas before, products in the past tended to get, as it were, repaired, they were either sent out on the basis we never want to see the product back, because otherwise it's called a product recall, or they get serviced. And they would, the product in question might either have an individual go and service that product, or they would take that product back to somewhere to be serviced. But of course, in the age of connected world, where you're looking at particularly high volumes, we've all probably got a phone in our pocket, I'm assuming, a great example of a very, very high population. Suddenly, those types of ways of doing operational support, those models don't work anymore. It's too expensive. And then if we pick up on our previous two speakers, we're not in there are 2 or 3 changes in our generations. You're now seeing something that's consistently evolving, new threats emerging. So therefore, the idea that you might take your product in to be serviced every couple of weeks because it needs a certain new software update would clearly not work.
Could I chip in?
Please do.
Is that okay? So I watched Richard labouring with a lot of this stuff through the early days, and I guess I'd like to summarise some of the things I saw out of that. So, 10 years ago, we got a set of evangelical people who discovered security, sometimes for the first time, sometimes not. One of the really useful things that came out of the security framework was this understanding, and I see it in the Cyber Resilience Act and things of this nature, and the regulations that are coming through, going now. What you actually started to discuss were things like well, if I'm doing radio interfaces, they've already got security components. This isn't security in a green field. This is security that has to fit into this. So the novelty of a lot of the stuff that the IoTSF did, from my perspective, was it understood this is what I'm doing with components that need radio interfaces. This is what I'm doing with components that have to fit into a landscape. And to me, that was really significant, because what they were doing was actually realising that's the value that you get out of these things. You don't do security just because we all like to do security. You do it to make money. You do it to secure society. You do it for whatever reason you're doing these sorts of things. But it's a thing that has to be fitting in with all the rest of the things, and it's what you were hearing from the keynote speeches before. This isn't something that sits in isolation. It's not something that you do and tie it up and you're done. This was a scale that we hadn't really been seeing. It was a cost that we hadn't really been seeing. But it had to put all of those things together. And I think the framework was for me, was the first framework of that sort, and has continued to be the preeminent one for actually putting together that kind of, how am I going to consider this in the context of a value proposition, and how am I going to give guidance to people about that at whatever stage in their careers they are. I think the Foundation has done a fantastic job in trying to put those things together, and if you look at the CRA stuff now, that's exactly what you're seeing. Those things that are developing quickly are those things that have understood the markets that they're going into. Those things that are going more slowly are those things that actually don't understand why they want it yet.
To add to that, if I may,
Go on,
going back to the start of the IoTSF when we set it up, to riff off Peter's point, there is a lot of knowledge in the industry, but it's locked up in a few people and in a few industries. The challenge with the IoT is to enable new entrants, new types of products, new types of solutions. And it is about socializing some of these very technical issues and nuanced points into a much wider audience. And I think this is why the assurance framework has been downloaded so many times. If we lock up the knowledge into a few people's heads, the people in this room, fantastic. We know what we're talking about on the whole. We have some very interesting conversations, and it's great. But it's a bit like politicians. If they're all together, not a lot happens. It's only when we get the assurance framework into people's hands, into different industries, into the IoT, whatever that means, that it really adds value. It is about enabling a broader conversation. I think this is the fantastic thing that the IoTSF has done. We are leading the conversation. We're enabling more people to join the conversation and enabling better products. My example on this is Cyber Essentials. Cyber Essentials it's fine. It's a good thing for people to do. But the reality is asking an SME to protect themselves against a nation-state attack is crazy. It's never going to work. It's only when we start to impact the DNA of our systems and our solutions with proper technology that we're going to change the game. So, it's how we take these concepts, take these technologies, and start pushing them into solutions that will start to win. And I think this is the key thing that the Foundation has done. It's socializing, communicating the best practices. That was always the point of the initial work, and I think we've done a great job of achieving that.
That's great, thanks. Now, two of you mentioned the CRA, the EU Cyber Resilience Act, right? Richard and Peter. Here's the question. How can the IoTSF assurance framework help companies prepare for that?
I probably could pick that one up. Just for those who are not aware, I am actually on the BSI working group. In fact, I'm the convener for the BSI working group for WG9, the Senelec WG9 CRA horizontal standards. But moving on to the point, it's very relevant because, ironically, as Hayden was just saying, one of the things that came out a lot of the discussions in the early period of the framework wasn't just about, in its early years it was often perceived as a consumer type framework, but in fact it was always intended to be far more than that. And that was one of the reasons why there is the whole basis of having a set of classifications. It isn't just a one-size-fits-all assurance framework, and that was very deliberate, not least of which very quickly, because it was evident that even if you take one standard type of product, the requirements that may impinge on that product, we always used to use the example of the thermostat. A domestic thermostat's one thing. A thermostat used, for example, in process control, the implications of a malfunction of any sort is completely different. But to come back to the CRA, the CRA, for those people who are involved with the standards work in the CRA work, the timescales by standardisation norms are exceedingly short, in that we're literally talking just over 2 years to having standards ready to be used by industry to comply with the CRA Act. And for anybody who's been around the standards world for a while will know that 2 years, particularly in some cases that involve harmonised standards, that is blisteringly quick. And the challenge for a lot of companies is that CRA, because of its broad scope, far broader than RED. For those who aren't familiar, that's the one that affects wireless products. The challenge there is that for most companies, it will affect hardware, and for most companies that means at least a year runway, in some sectors considerably longer. So the idea that companies are going to wait for the standards to fall out sometime in early 2027 is just not practical for virtually most commercial organisations. So to wait, my advice, obviously biased as I might be, is that actually that's where the framework has value, because whilst the framework doesn't necessarily phrase the requirements in the exact form as they might appear in the standards, the fundamental principles are the same. So the assurance framework gives companies the ability, as it were, to get prepared for whatever the final standards come out like, but at least put them in a very strong position. And just very quickly, there have been assessments in the past to existing standards, EN 303645, NIST 8259. There's also been I think I presented a brief session on EN 18031, the standard for RED, and pretty much in all cases, if you'd already followed all the requirements in the assurance framework, you would be in a very, very strong position to be able to declare conformance with those various directives and standards. Peter?
Peter, before you pick it up, I was going to move it to you anyway. No, I'm going to move it to you. And I'm going to pick up one of Hayden's points. Hayden talked a bit about how useful the assurance framework was if you're an SME, let's say. He didn't put it quite as crudely as that, but that was roughly it. Now, you work on the sort of business risk side of things. Is it true, IoTSF, it seems to me, is very aware that security doesn't happen in a vacuum. Security happens in a company that's got all sorts of other competing priorities. It's navigating the market, it's navigating the regulatory landscape, it's trying to turn a profit, it's trying to weigh up risk. We heard earlier about the need to decide what level of risk you're happy with. I mean, how do you see the relationship between security and running a business? Is security good for business?
Speaking as a director of security concepts who spends my life doing security, I absolutely believe it's good for business. And in fact, I think it's one of the underplayed things in relation to that. And I actually think that's one of the things that the IoTSF is actually quite good at drawing out. You don't exist to do security, you exist in order to do all the other things. It's not an end in itself. And indeed, I don't understand what security means if you don't actually tie it to other objectives that you're trying to achieve. So the way you might do security for safety and the way you might do security for privacy. And I think the most underdeveloped thing here, and And I guess Richard was starting to talk about that, and Hayden was talking about that, and I'm sure if we gave her a chance to talk, you'd talk about that too. Yeah. The most important thing here is if you're looking to raise capital, if you're looking to exist through life, nowadays I find it very difficult to think of any digital product or any cyber-physical product, so that embraces the whole of the IoT world, as far as I'm concerned, that doesn't require security. And Richard was saying you can't upload your next software. So if you do DevOps and you want to do a minimum viable product, you need to be able to update it. Visa wouldn't exist without security. You know, trading money is a difficult thing to do if you can't secure it. You know, all of these items, you know, the mobile phone industry wouldn't exist. That if you go through these things, it's just so hard to think of anything. But in the rush to new standards, the danger that I think has come out is part of this. We start to see it as an end in itself, and it's almost, that's the objective. And the IoTSF is a really good antidote to that. And indeed, it's one of the things I keep saying to my fellow security professionals. See yourself as part of the value proposition. If I go and talk to my CEO, you know, he or she does not want, you know, to be told all about my compliance activities. They want to be told about how I can help them make money. Look at the way that you do compliance. If you're doing it as I do it this one and I do that one, you'll end up with that costing you orders of magnitude more than it should be. And that's money you're not spending on developments, you're not spending on other things. It's not just that, you know, it's not just something that you should discuss in terms of, you know, in terms of what should I spend on compliance. It's in terms of, this is part of my overarching development process. And you heard this when you were talking about AI. It's part of your process. It's part of your frameworks. It's part of all the things you do in relation to that. How am I going to do through life risk? Yeah, particularly if I'm in something where I get most of my money at the beginning from a product sale. Right. Those aspects and the financial aspects of it are absolutely critical to delivering. Yeah, I don't get to do security if I can't also do business. Thank you. And I think that's
great. I'm going to bring Anna Maria.
Yeah, can I add something?
Let me just set you up a bit. You're on a panel with 3 blokes, all of whom make their money out of selling security. You don't make your money out of selling security. You come at it from, I don't know, a different perspective, from the university world. And I think one of the points about Anna Maria joining us on the board is to try to make sure that the IoTSF sources of expertise are as wide as possible. So how does it look from a university perspective? What are the main issues why are you interested in security? Yeah. What are the main problems you see?
Thank you very much. First of all, I'm very excited to be here. And I started following the IoT Security Foundation when I started my Internet of Things testbed at University College London. And we saw that basically the IoT landscape and IoT threats was like changing dynamically. And we set up these testbeds for trying to measuring security. And we do research, of course, so we look at the future. But then we started to think how we can also thinking of the future, like helping challenges in the present. And basically what I think is that academia has ideas, and you, industry, policymakers have challenges. So IoT Security Foundation is like a great place for these kind of exchanges. How us having like research and ideas and equipment and testbeds, we can help you solving your present challenges. So this is why I found the IoT Security Foundation being an absolutely good place for this kind of discussion. But not only that, our research is also like good fit for policymakers. And we discuss policies in our lab. We take the going back to the Cyber Resilience Act, for example. I was very excited when I read it and when I heard about it, until I read it. Because basically one of the things that we started to do in our lab is the same thing that we are doing nowadays with the Cyber Resilience Act, is taking past regulations, like, for example, the one for privacy, the GDPR, and trying to measure GDPR for Internet of Things devices. We started with consumers, but then we went to industrial devices and medical Internet of Things devices. and we saw how difficult it is to put in practice the requirements that regulations put in place nowadays. And we discovered that the majority of these requirements, I don't know how many of you read these 400 pages of the Cyber Resilience Act, maybe not many, but the idea is like, how can we help developers to understand these regulations in a practical ways? And this is what we try to do in our lab, in our laboratory, but of course, we cannot be isolated. Our research cannot stay only in our four walls of university. So we need organizations like the IoT Security Foundations as a stage for showcasing our research and our outcome from the research.
That's great. Thank you very much. I'm going to go to Hayden now. So, Hayden, you alluded earlier when you spoke to kind of looking ahead, the sort of challenges that are coming at us in this area. You're a great expert on this. Well, what do you think are the real challenges that were perhaps creeping up on us without us being aware?
I think the biggest challenge is that security is everywhere and everything. It touches, as Peter was saying, all aspects of organizations. It is at the root of how organizations make money, whether it's a service, whether it's TV, whether it's trading, whether it's selling devices to consumers. The other big one is that it is such a pernicious challenge. It's all around us, as we saw earlier. You know, McKinsey highlighted that the impact of lack of cybersecurity is $10.5 trillion per annum. Now, given the GDP of the world is only 110 trillion, that's 10%. That's huge. It is everywhere. It's all consuming, and the fact that we can't deal with it is a huge indictment on our industry. So how do we start to turn the tide? And I think the key thing when we look at the technologies is that we have to move them from sticking plasters, where we are addressing the symptoms, to actually start to address the root causes. Now, I've got a session later on, and at the moment, most of you know I'm harping on around memory safety. And memory safety issues are behind 70% of critical vulnerabilities. 70%. We've known about memory safety issues since 1972. That's 40, 50 years. It's pretty appalling. So what we have to do as an industry, I think, is look at how we address the foundational technologies. So some of this is better languages. You know, Rust and Swift and things along these lines are fantastic. But we've had Ada for a while. Why isn't it front and center? Why did we fail with that if we did fail? I think some of the other aspects which were pulled out earlier, I mean, AI, again, all-consuming. We're seeing a lot of enterprises refocusing their engineering around AI, and that's great. It's a great tool, but it also comes with great risks, as we know. So how do we ensure that our large language models are protected and that our inferencing can't be nudged? You know, how do we limit, how do we constrain these domains so that we don't increase the size of this problem? I mentioned Cyber Essentials earlier, and it's a little tongue-in-cheek because I'm a great believer in everybody doing their piece. But there is an asymmetry in how the world is working right now that we are expecting SMEs to implement Cyber Essentials and be protected against North Korea. It's bizarre. It's never going to work. So instead, we have to ensure that the purchasing decisions and the requirements for products are lifted. We have to make sure that the compliance frameworks are fit for purpose. They've come in, they're bare minimal, I think. We have to lift all of the boats in the harbour on the tide of enhanced security. So there are technologies coming through. There's better processors. There's technologies like Cherry in the memory safe department. We'll talk about that later on this afternoon. There are other ways of doing it, but we have to reduce the attack surface massively, and we have to start delivering better solutions, not technology.
That's great. Now, we're very nearly out of time, and I'm going to now do something which I think for which none of us is prepared, unfortunately. I'm going to ask the members of the panel to pretend they actually work for an advertising agency. And you're doing a pitch to the IoTSF, and in one sentence, you have to say what the strapline, the key advertising slogan for the IoTSF should be built on. And it could be, I'll continue to talk for a bit while you think about it, because it's a bit unfair. So it could be, for example, Hayden just said, and he had, I thought it was a good line, actually. Many of his lines are good, by the way, but I thought this was particularly good. IoTSF lifts all boats. I thought it was a great line, actually. So you can use that again if you want. You can use that again if you want. So, but there may be others. There may be, IoTSF brings everyone together. IoTSF distills the essential expertise. IoTSF is at the cutting edge of technology and business. Whatever it is, I've just chucked out 4. You can use any of those if you like. I'm going to start with... Richard, you raised your microphone, so that looked to me like you were ready to go.
Well, I was going to say, actually, if I can slide in another sentence just before you do,
Go on.
But it is a piece of advertising. So very quickly, the whole point, if you haven't already got the mission, I hope you have, the assurance framework is there, particularly to pick up on Anna's point, which is implementing this stuff is hard. And I'm really delighted, having been so heavily involved with the early days of the assurance framework, that Ian... from Microchip is running a session on where the assurance framework is going. As John alluded, there's some very exciting news around that. So apart from the fact I'm delighted that Ian is very much carrying the banner forward, but also that he's really talking about where it's going. So if you haven't already considered doing that session, I thoroughly encourage you to do it.
That's great. So your sentence is, IoTSF is there because implementing this stuff is hard. Peter?
I think I'd go from... valuing security and security professionals.
Can you say that again? IoTSF is there...
It helps. It's there to value security and security professionals.
Okay, great. Anna, you up for this?
Okay, I will try to do this in a professional way without Italian accent. IoTSF, bridging academia with industry. Easy.
Bridging academia what?
With industry.
With industry, great. Hayden, you have to move on from the boats one. Go on.
Securing your business.
IoTSF is there, securing your business. I think on that note, and all the other notes that we've heard from the members of the panel, I think we're just about on time. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you, and let's thank the panel in the normal way.